for a minute here.
Oh no.
Yeah, it was a ride, but I'm on the other side of it.
That's good. Oh my gosh. Thanks for
Yeah.
giving the talk.
Wouldn't miss it for the world. Okay, so can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about my research I did at CSUN for my master's thesis. It's a survey of protoplanetary disks in Taurus star-forming region. In the background, we have a map of Taurus. That's actually the bright star in Taurus. So it's located in the kind of northeastern side up here. So let's go through it. So let's go through a quick outline. First, I'm going to talk about, introduce the problem, kind of talk a little bit about the motivation of how protoplanetary disks would tie into planets, exoplanets. And then we're going to talk about our observations and how we selected our sample. We derived some stellar properties, so we're going to go over that, and then talk about some of the dust properties we derived for these disks and some of the main results. So here I have a picture that actually recently came out from NASA that shows all the exoplanets discovered, and we have our galaxy, familiar Milky Way curve. So there's more than 4,000 confirmed exoplanets, and this raises the question of how are these formed? And another thing is there's been recent, by maybe in the last 10 years, there's been a few studies that tried to correlate the planet fraction or exoplanet frequency and the stellar mass. And we can see the Johnson et al. Survey in 2010, which focused on planets around less than 2 AU. And then we also have the Dallar et al. Study at 2016, which focused on planets that are 5 to 13 Jupiter masses at distances of 30 to 300 AU. So we have a close-up and a further look on this. And we can see that the larger the star is, the more likely it is to hold larger Jupiter or higher than Jupiter mass planets. So then we will, if protoplanetary disks are truly where planets come from, then we're looking to see if there is a similar trend in basically the mass and the disk of the protoplanets. So our observations were actually done Karma before it retired. Karma is actually located in Central California around Owens Valley. The observations I looked at were surveys done between 2010 and 2013. At wavelength of 3 millimeter, this survey actually extended the previous sample of 39 disks, basically quadrupled it, more or less. And on the right side, we can see kind of the distribution of the sample across the Taurus region. And we can see they're mostly localized. And we actually were able to get a 3-dimensional map of all of these stars, which will come up soon. And then we reduced our sample. So we only are focusing on class 2 disks. This is where the envelope has dissipated. And so the envelope being in class 1, this envelope has dissipated. So we're truly looking at the disk. And at class 3, the disk has kind of dissipated as well, which would make them too faint. So we're only focusing on class 2 disks in our sample. And we are trying to avoid the complicated kind of setup that can happen with more than one star. So we're removing all multiple stars. So we reduced the sample to 97 disks of single class 2 stars. And then first, we need to derive some stellar properties. So that brings in the question of distances. So we actually use parallax distances from the Gaia Space Telescope. And we created this distribution of distances. For some of the disks, the distances were more reliable, so those are shown in the blue histogram, and the pink histogram shows the ones that were less reliable because of Gaia errors, or there were multiple stars, so the Gaia couldn't get a clear point spread function. So those are inferred by looking at the local disks. And we can actually see this duality, this 2-horn of Taurus, that's been dubbed by a recent paper. So we can see that the stars are kind of more localized, and if you can look at the right-hand animation, we can actually see that. So these might actually be different groups that we previously thought as one cluster at 140 parsecs. We can actually see it's at 130 and 160, 2 separate groups. Then we took those distances and we updated the luminosities. And we had the information about the temperature and luminosity from the literature. And so we plotted them on a HR diagram. And we used evolutionary pre-main sequence evolutionary tracks from Baraf et al. For low mass stars, and for non-magnetic Phidon tracks for the high mass stars. And we used some statistical studies to kind of interpolate the mass and age from the luminosity and temperature. So on the left-hand side here, I actually have a single star, and we go out to 2 sigma from the central star into these 2 circles. And we sample all of these gray points in this region and interpolate them to their mass and age. And we get this spread on the right-hand side in the mass and age space. And so we pick the peak of the distribution, which is not so Gaussian, but we picked the peak of the distribution to be the most likely value. And then we went 34% area on either side of the peak to get our 68% confidence interval, or 1 sigma confidence interval. And we repeated these for about 184 stars. We actually updated the stellar masses for all the stars, even the multiples in the sample. And then after that, we need to derive some dust mass estimates. And so dust mass can actually be estimated if we know the flux, the distance, the kappa coefficient, which is dust opacity, and the Planck function, which relies on dust temperature. So we can assume a value for the opacity. This is actually from a paper in the 90s. And we have the fluxes, we have the distances. Now the question is, how do we estimate the dust temperature? So historically, what's been done is we assume a 20 Kelvin temperature, and because this is true because most of the emission is coming from the outer regions of the disk, and it's colder further away from the star, so 20 Kelvin is a reasonable estimate. In 2013, the Andrews et al. Paper actually suggested a different scaling, and we calculated that, and we actually see that the average of that distribution is at 20 Kelvin. So from that, we actually estimated that about 30% of the disks have dust masses larger than 10 Earth masses, and 50% have more than 5 Earth masses. Assuming 5 Earth masses is enough to create a Jupiter core, then have a runaway gas accretion, about 50% of these disks can have a Jupiter-like planet eventually. Then we derive the spectral index. So the spectral index can tell us about the opacity. We had observations in 2 other wavelengths of these disks, so we were able to derive the spectral index as a slope of this fit. And we did this for 57 of our disks. So here's a distribution of the spectral index of the disks, and we can see that about 75% of the disks had spectral indices larger than 2, which means they're optically thin, so their mass estimates are reliable. However, 25% of the disks were optically thick, according to the spectral index value, which means we are underestimating their masses. And on the right side, we actually plot the 25% that had spectral indices less than 2 against the Planck function, when we can actually see the optical thickness hypothesis sort of being confirmed by this pink line that shows the spectral index of the Planck function as a function of temperature. So then we plot them for the 2 different temperature assumptions. We plot the dust mass versus the stellar mass. And we can see a trend that has and we use LinMix to do some statistical analysis of the fits, which takes into account the uncertainty in X and Y, as well as the upper limits of our observations. And we were able to derive slopes of about 1. So there's a 1-to-1 ratio, or it's a power law, but it's a slope of 1, which was actually derived within the uncertainty by Sean Andrews, as well as Pascucci et al. For the chameleon region. So this is in accordance with other regions or other studies of the same region. And then we need to attack these blue points, which are basically underestimated masses. So what we do is we actually increase the mass of those by a factor of arbitrary factors of 1, 2, 5, and 10. And we kind of look at how the slope would change. And we can actually see that the change in slope isn't much. So the 2 different colors are for assuming constant temperatures and assuming the Andrews temperatures. So we can actually see that it doesn't increase the slope much, and we drop in correlation. So maybe we can't just kind of jump up the underestimation by certain factors and hope that it works. So some of the future prospects that we can take this work to is observe disks at longer wavelengths. So maybe we'll leave the optically thick region and go towards optically thin regions, get better information there. Maybe spatially resolve them and see if there are some substructures like rings and gaps that are contributing to the spectral index value. We could also try to model the disks using RAD-MC3D, which someone else in the group was working on for another region, upper score region actually. So we could actually model the disks and see if we can duplicate some of these spectral index values and some of these mass values and see if there is any substructures coming up in the 3D modeling. And we could also repeat the analyses for other star forming regions. And I think we have the group has a study on, can't remember. I think we had a study on Ophiuchus that's going to be in the next session of ALMA, I believe. So yeah, that concludes my talk, and thank you, everyone. Open for questions.
Thank you so much for that, especially giving it while sick. Really appreciated. Great talk. I don't have any questions in the Slack yet. So I guess I'll ask a question. So you said that you were looking at, you ended up getting about 25% of the disks being optically thick. Do you have like a sense of how common that is for other star forming regions that have been looked at?
Actually, this, so the studies of the spectral index were actually recent. This hasn't been done before, to my knowledge, for any region, because we didn't have as long of a spread in observation wavelengths where we could get a reliable fit to this slope. So now we can actually have like a 89 millimeter, a 3 millimeter, and then we have a 1.33 that kind of strikes the bounds and within the center. So this hasn't been done before. When we always assume they're optically thin at longer wavelengths. Now we're seeing maybe some of them. This was actually a surprising result. This 25% down here actually took an entire year to figure out what's happening.
Yeah, I see a couple of people typing in the chat. We'll just give that a minute. But yeah, I thought that was interesting. Yeah, the relative fraction, especially for the class 2 objects. What's your, oh, here we go. Question from Kevin Fogarty. Do any of your disks have archival Herschel observations?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Give it another minute. Do you have any observational sort of follow-ups that you're planning, or is it kind of just in the air so far?
It's in the air so far, especially for this region. It's definitely in the air. Probably at the next graduate student we'll pick it up.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I'm actually working with someone in the group that's gonna pick up on some of the stellar mass estimates work, so.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that whole finite lifetime of a grad student thing. All right, I don't see any other questions, so thank you again for your talk.
Mm-hmm.